talking about theories and looking at some of the theories, two of the theories that we'll be using as foundation theories throughout the semester. Because theories often are something hard to kind of hold on to and have an understanding of, I want to take just a couple of minutes and kind of do a real quick review of the two theories that we looked at the other day. So we started off looking at ecological theory. Without looking at your notes, let's just see what you might remember. Ecological theory is interested in what aspect of development? Just in your own words. Anyone remember? What aspect of development is ecological theory focused on? Anyone at all? What context? All right, social. It's interested in the social environmental aspect. And we looked at 5 different subsystems. And again, can anyone tell me, the first one we looked at was microsystem. Anyone remember what microsystem is? What that subsystem is? Because again, it's real important that you want to kind of review, kind of scan back through your notes from one class period to the next. It'll help reinforce the information. What? Excellent, excellent. The microsystem has to do with the places that we have most direct interaction. It's kind of thinking about those places where we have face-to-face contact on a regular basis. Now, the mesosystem, and that's related to our microsystems. Anyone remember what the mesosystem is? Just excellent. When we look at the mesosystem, we're looking at where the different microsystems interact or overlap or affect one another. Great. Now, this one's a little bit more challenging. The exosystem. Again, don't worry about memorizing the definitions in class as much as just an understanding. What's the exosystem as it relates to the individual, regardless of the age?
Wasn't that like our parents' work?
That's an example. So the parents' work would be an example of that system.
The things that affect you but you're not directly involved in.
All right, excellent. It's those systems, those settings that directly affects you, but you are not necessarily directly involved in that system itself. Again, like parents' workplace, we used other examples like the school board, city council, other political kinds of arenas. Excellent. And the macro system is simply what? Nope, that's the next one. What's the macro system simply refer to? Anyone remember? Again, in just your own words.
The global system?
What's that?
The global system?
The global system or society as a whole. It's just looking at the broader society. So we move from the microsystem to the macro system. And then the last one, the chronosystem, refers to the time. The time period of which an individual is developing. All right, then we looked at social learning theory. Social learning theory simply says that a person or an individual learns things as the result of imitation, simply observing another individual or another situation and then repeating that behavior. We talked about 4 processes, 4 steps to social learning. The first one is the individual must first do what? Excellent. First must attend to the behavior of another person, and attend, remember, focuses on, give attention to that behavior. Then after that, the person must do what? Second step or second process?
Remember.
Excellent. They must remember that behavior, then they will repeat it. Excellent. Now, that's not the final process. That behavior then must be reinforced in order for learning to really take place or for it to become a lasting behavior pattern. Now, we looked at, what I want to do is relate to 2 theories for a second. We looked at the ecological theory, the social context. We looked at social learning behavior. The last time we met, we were looking at a number of examples of one of the microsystems. And we looked at often the role that parents or family plays in terms of modeling behavior. But there are other micro settings or microsystems where social learning can take place as well. One that comes to mind is the whole concept of mentoring. And so if we think of someone mentoring us, say in our profession, I know we got several who are nursing students, and so it's like a nurse that maybe has had more experience, more knowledge, mentors us. And so what happens is we observe them, we watch them, And then we, again, later on will remember and imitate some of those behaviors and some of those patterns. And that could be true in any of our chosen professions, that there may be someone who acts as a mentor. Another common microsystem that plays a larger role than sometimes we realize, and again, this can happen in terms of positive behaviors as well as negative behaviors, is the media and TV. Do you think individuals pay any attention to what they see in the media? TV programming, and do you think that in any way shapes attitudes or values or behaviors? Yeah, I think most time we would say definitely. And again, remember, social learning theory, can model the kinds of positive attitudes and values as one, as well as some of those that maybe we do not want. I was reminded of an article I cut out a number of years ago of a TV program that all of you, whether you've watched it or not, are at least familiar with. Though I don't know that it's even still on the air today. I haven't seen an episode of it in a long time. A 13-year-old boy was hospitalized with second and third degree burns after mimicking an MTV personality who set himself on fire during a stunt show. I won't mention the name of the youth, but the boy was severely burned Friday night when he and a friend poured gasoline on his feet and legs and lit him on fire while imitating the stunt on MTV's high-rated show Jackass. And again, that's not the only incident that's been reported of individuals, again, who have observed that TV program, and in spite of the warnings that says do not try this at home, again, those behaviors were remembered and then for whatever reasons repeated or imitated in a different situation or setting, and then obviously there was some reinforcement or some response, which may have distinguished that behavior in terms of the future. So there's lots of different places in microsystems where individuals will observe, remember, repeat certain behaviors that they've seen. Okay, so we've looked at ecological theory. We've looked at social learning theory. And again, hang on to the basics. Social learning theory, observe, and then imitate. And then be aware of those four processes. I want to look at another learning theory. Applies a little bit of a different approach. Still involves forms of reinforcement as key. And that's what we refer to as operant conditioning. This is a form of learning in which the consequences of behavior produce changes in the probability of the behavior's occurrence. Again, simply put, that determination of whether we will continue a behavior or not is directly related to what the consequences are to that behavior. In virtually everything that we do, there is some type of corresponding consequence to it. And that consequence will influence, again, whether we're likely to repeat that behavior or not. Again, it's a form of learning in which the consequences of behavior produce changes in the probability or the likelihood that that behavior will occur again. Now, very much like social learning, it is based on, and again here we're talking about the likelihood that it will continue. Behaviors that we would like to see increased or will likely increase is dependent upon reinforcement. Now, one of the things that might be helpful to you is, again, as you're writing down notes, is I encourage you to underline or later on highlight key words. A lot of times the key to answering the question on an exam or understanding the concept is simply related to one or two key words. And so when we talk about reinforcement, again, the two key words here are consequence. Reinforcement is a consequence that increases. And that's the other key word. That the response to our behavior, if it is a reinforcement, will increase the probability or the likelihood that that behavior will occur again in the future. Now, the first type of reinforcement is pretty easy to understand. Students don't struggle with this one at all. What we call positive reinforcement. The frequency of a response increases because it is followed by a positive stimulus or a positive consequence. In other words, we receive something. Something is added. It's something that's positive or rewarding to us. And because of that, we are likely to continue that behavior. And we continue it because we're likely going to be rewarded in some kind of way. Now let's look at a couple of simple examples. Anybody in here happen to get any kind of a reward or positive reinforcement for good grades when you were younger? And maybe you still get them today, I don't know. Anybody get money for grades? Did you get money? Okay. Anybody else happen to get financial reinforcement of some kind? Now, your parents gave you money, however it was set up, for those good grades because why? What was the receiving the financial reinforcement? And they did that because, what was their hope? Yeah, that you're going to continue to work harder in order to continue to make good grades. I mean, it was an incentive, with the hopes that you'll continue to put that effort forward and continue to make good grades. Did anybody else receive a different type of positive reinforcement, maybe for grades?
Free time. If we had to do more stuff if we didn't get our homework done or on time.
Oh.
We got on time. We got abilities to do other things.
All right. If you did what was expected of you, then you got different privileges or free time to do some things that you want to do. Maybe not necessarily a financial reinforcement, but still something. You got something added to you that you found rewarding as an incentive, again, to continue to make good grades. Now, my son, though I'm sure that he would like the system that some of you have, doesn't necessarily get money for good grades, but one of the things that we try to do is that when he does or performs really well academically is to go do something special. And what we try to do on a regular basis is to verbally reinforce, the effort that he's put forth into those grades. And part of that's with the hopes that whatever that form of reinforcement will be an incentive for him to want to continue to put forth the effort. One of the things that we've been trying to instill in him, that he can begin himself to reinforce, having done good grades, because for him it was a good thing to do or something that he wanted to do, and that he felt good about having made an A versus having made a D. And that becomes, again, a form of reinforcement. But something is added that makes you want to continue, to do that. And so it can come into something that's extrinsic or external, but does not necessarily have to be. So, positive reinforcement. Again, the key here is it's intended to increase the likelihood that the behavior will continue. Now, this one is the one that I think creates some confusion for students. And that's negative reinforcement. Now, again, what you want to highlight, put a star by, is that, again, the desire is an increase in behavior. What tends to happen is students often tend to equate negative reinforcement with punishment, and they're not the same thing. And we'll try to illustrate that in a moment. Because the goal, and what you want to do is look at what's the goal. If the goal is to increase a particular behavior, then what we're doing is looking for some type of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, we're going to add something. Something that's found, again, rewarding. Now, with negative reinforcement, we still want to increase the behavior. But it involves either removing some type of a negative stimulus or some type of a negative consequence, or involves avoiding experiencing, again, that negative response or that negative consequence. Now, we'll look at a couple of examples here because, again, I think it's one of the harder ones. Again, remember, the goal is I want to increase a particular behavior. Now, looking at this class, my attendance policy is, I guess you could say, a form of negative reinforcement. Now, I guess positive reinforcement would be to give you something. And I guess in a sense you have been. You all started with X number of points at the beginning of the semester. Now, some of you may be motivated to come to class. My desire is for you to have increased attendance in class and to come frequently. And so some of you will come to avoid what? What's the negative stimulus that you want to avoid? Exactly. Points being subtracted from attendance. And so to avoid that from occurring, you choose to come to class. If that indeed is, and some of you may choose to come to class regardless of that reinforcement. But again, the desire is to increase attendance or the frequency of attendance, and some will choose to do that to avoid, that stimulus. I commute from Marshfield to Springfield every day, and right now there's a section of the highway that's being worked on. And so you come across this one particular area that says work zone 60 miles an hour. Now, that work zone 60 mile an hour is intended to send a message. And what is that message? What is the desired behavior? Slow down. So the desired behavior is to slow down. And so in a sense, if I were not to slow down, what would be the consequence? Charge the fine, a rather steep fine. And so that becomes a negative stimulus. And so to avoid experiencing that $250 fine, I choose to slow down. But the fine would likely not be the only potential negative stimulus. What else would I be attempting to avoid that actually might be more costly long-term than the fine? Someone getting hurt. Exactly. An accident occurring. What else might be another negative stimulus I might be trying to avoid? What else might go up? We have no speeders in this classroom. That's great. Anything else that might get more costly for me? Insurance. So to avoid my insurance premiums going up, I choose to slow down. Again, it's a form of reinforcement. What behavior is being increased or maintained? Slowing down at that point. There was a period of time, not as much lately, where my son has this tendency. For him, most of his life, every room in the house has been his room. And so he literally would play in every room of the house. And he would kind of rotate from one room to the other. But there was one behavior that I had trouble increasing consistently. Anyone want to take a guess at what that behavior was? Happens every day, even to this point. Related to his play. Picking up after himself. It would seem like things would get dragged out and brought into every room and then left there. And so my son would hear what he would refer to as my fussing at him to put things away. Now, he began to put things away to increase the desired behavior I wanted, because what did he want to avoid? The fussing, exactly. Take that up from on another level, it becomes one of the reinforcements in terms of husbands and wives. Wives complain often that husbands don't do what they're supposed to do. Husbands complain that their wives do what? Nag. So to avoid the nagging, it may become a motivator to increase the behaviors of doing whatever was requested or desired. Again, the intent is to increase a behavior by avoiding or removing something that's not desired or wanted. And again, don't get it confused with punishment, because the difference is the desire to increase a particular behavior that is desired. Now, like I said, it often gets confused, and sometimes it's a matter of the perspective of it with punishment. Punishment is a consequence that decreases, again, highlight, underline, because this is what makes it different than negative reinforcement. Punishment is a consequence that decreases the probability that a behavior will occur. So rather than increasing a behavior, what we're attempting to do now is decrease the behavior as a result of that consequence. As a kid growing up, can you think of a particular behavior that your parents were wanting you to do less of, and that there were certain consequences for that behavior? Anybody think of a particular behavior? I know it's hard to think of something just off the top of your head. Anybody in here ever get punished for something? Okay. What was there a particular consequence for that?
We'd have to sit in timeout or, on the couch for a certain amount of time.
Okay. Timeout or being separated or restricted to a particular area. Again, that's the consequence. And the intent of that consequence was to reduce a behavior, i.e., the amount of fighting that was taking place with a sibling. Anyone else think of a particular behavior that your parents might have been motivating you to do less of? I know one of the things that was not allowed in our household was whining. It was one of the behaviors that was attempted to be decreased. And so there were certain consequences for whining. Anyone ever have privileges taken away for anything? Again, sometimes people talk about being grounded, having privileges taken away maybe as an adolescent, and some of that was to distinguish a particular behavior so that it would occur less often. Whether that's breaking a curfew, and then being required to come in earlier. Again, there's some particular consequence. Again, the desire of that consequence was to decrease that behavior from occurring. And again, you could take a lot of these and just simply look at it. Am I trying to increase a behavior or am I attempting to decrease a behavior? And then the nature of that consequence is going to determine whether, again, it's a reinforcement or whether it's punishment. All right, operant conditioning. Again, remember, it's learning that occurs as a result of the consequences to that behavior. And we'll determine whether it's likely to continue to occur or be distinguished. All right, we have two more theories we want to look at, and then we'll begin to look specifically at some aspects of development. This is a theory that we will look at throughout the semester. Psychosocial theory. We will look at it at every stage of development. So it is a lifespan theory. Not all the theories necessarily cover the entire lifespan, or that the aspect of development that's being looked at tends to only have significant changes up to a certain point. But this is one of the theories that actually will have stages throughout the lifespan. Erik Erikson is the person who's associated with this theory. It's a theory that looks at personality development. And it suggests that personality develops according to predetermined steps that are maturationally set. Personality develops according to predetermined steps that are maturationally set. Now, again, just a quick review. We looked at terminology a couple of class periods ago. One of the things that we termed was maturation. So if these are maturationally set, what's that suggest? Again, just in your own words. Well, age appropriate, or that these are steps or stages that are going to occur, that they're determined largely by what? Excellent, genetics, exactly. And that's what Erikson believed, that as we look at these different stages or these different steps of development, that to a large extent they're kind of genetically determined or influenced to a large extent, and these experiences we're all going to have. Now, when they occur, there may be some variations in when they actually do occur, and that they don't occur on a given chronological age or time, but that all individuals tend to move through these same sequences or patterns. And that'll make sense as we kind of move and look at each one of those stages throughout the semester. Now, this is a significant part of Erikson's theory. Each stage presents the individual with a crisis. Now, I like the word challenge better. The resolution of one stage lays the foundation for responding to the challenges of the next. Each stage presents the individual with a crisis or a challenge. Resolution of one stage lays the foundation for responding to the challenges of the next. Okay, someone take a look at that. What's that mean in just simple terms? Anyone want to take a shot at that? What are we talking about here? Each stage presents the individual with a challenge. And we'll take a look, or just a very brief look at Erickson's first stage to try to illustrate that. Any thoughts? In terms of what that means. Resolution of one stage lays the foundation responding to the challenges of the next.
That has something to do like a potty training or something. And if that's a challenge for a little kid, as soon as they meet that challenge, they can move on to go into the next stage.
Okay. That's a good example in terms of she was referring to potty training and how having mastered that one may lay the foundation or be related to another event in that child's life. Well, it's simply talking about that what happens, and how we deal with the challenges or the events at one stage of our life is going to influence, again, how we respond and deal with the challenges of the next. Now, let me give you the last key concept, and then we'll take a look at Erickson's first stage. And we'll revisit again when we get to that particular stage of development. There is a balancing of a positive trait and a corresponding negative trait. Now, Erickson's first stage, and this is a stage that occurs, and you don't need to write this part down at this point, because we'll revisit it when we get to the first stage of infancy. But Erickson's first stage says that the first challenge has to do with one of trust versus mistrust. That's the first stage. It occurs from birth through the first year and a half. And like I said, we'll revisit that again. But the positive and corresponding negative trait is one of trust versus mistrust. And so the challenge is whether the child will develop a sense of trust or not. And later on in the semester, we'll talk more specifically about the concept of attachment. But basically, Erikson believes that a child basically wants to and needs to develop a sense of trust. Now, how does that relate, do you think, to a newborn or an infant? What are the issues of trust? And like I said, we'll summarize this more in detail later on. We got this newborn that comes into the world. And what can we conclude? How do you think trust plays into this child's experiences of life? Because Erikson suggests is that how they deal with and establish a sense of trust. What are they needing to trust? One of the things they need to do is to be able to trust the caregiver, that they'll be taken care of. And why is that significant in terms of building trust in that caregiver? Remember, we talked about that we all have basic human needs. And so when this newborn comes into the world, they are what in terms of their needs initially? They're demanding, and what would be another word? Dependent. They are totally dependent on the caregivers in their lives to do what? Provide for those basic needs. They're not able to meet virtually any of those needs initially. Now, they will develop at some point to a place where they can meet more and more of their own needs. But initially, they are totally dependent. And the extent to which those needs get met or not will determine whether they indeed can trust their caregivers. But also, it helps them develop a sense of trust in what else? Depending upon how those needs get met. Apart from the caregiver, what else are they needing to build a sense of trust in? Definitely themselves, as that evolves over time. And one other thing. Be a newborn. You just come into this world, and what is this world to you? Is there anything familiar about it initially? No, it's a foreign place. And so one of the issues is, do I not only build a sense of trust in the caregivers, but do I build a sense of trust in myself? But then also do I build a sense of trust that this world that I've come into is and I'm going to, not consciously or cognitively, but I begin to develop a sense of that this world is a safe, good place or not. And that determination is going to be based upon how caregivers respond to me and what my experiences of life early on are. If, and again we'll illustrate this more in detail later, if my early experiences in life are not positive, if my needs are not met or met inconsistently, what do I begin to believe about this world and the people in this world? What am I going to begin to believe? It's hostile, or it's not safe, or at least it's going to be hard to or depend upon those that I am depending on. And I'm going to develop a sense of mistrust. Now Erickson would suggest that ideally what you want to do is to develop overall a sense of trust. But he would also suggest that you probably want some mistrust. That it's a balance. Why would you want a little mistrust as well? Why would that be a healthy thing? Exactly. Not everyone is safe, or every situation or circumstance is going to be safe, and not always is there going to be someone who will protect me from some of those dangers. So I wanted to develop early in my life a basic sense of trust, that this world is a good place, that I can count on people to take care of me and protect me. But I also want to face life with a certain amount of caution or apprehension. And then what Erickson would suggest is that that's going to depend upon and influence the next stage. Now, we're not going to identify that stage at this point because we'll talk about it later on. But how, as I get older, if I've developed a sense of trust, can you think of any way that that's going to impact how I interact in the world in the future versus if I develop a sense of mistrust? Just in general. Excellent. Going to be more friendlier. You're going to have a more positive outlook on situations. How else might your behavior be impacted as I get older? Can you think of any other way that my behavior will be influenced? Trust versus if I have a sense of distrust or mistrust? Excellent. Confidence. And so as I get older and I am allowed more opportunities, I'm going to approach them with a different sense of confidence. And what am I going to be more willing to do if I have confidence? And this is true in your life today. Take risks. Exactly. However, if my early development develops an overriding sense of mistrust, rather than having confidence in myself, confidence in others, and confidence in this world, I'm going to have more doubt and more insecurity, and I'm going to be less willing to take risks. That's what Erickson's talking about. That how I resolve this particular stage is going to influence how I then move towards the next stage in my life. And what he would suggest is if you look at the stage that you're at right now, as young adults, that who you are today, and in terms of how you face life, deal with life, respond to life, has a lot to do with how you have resolved the different stages up to this point in your life. And we'll talk more about it obviously later, but when we get to young adulthood and we talk about what the challenge is to you at this stage in your life and how you resolve that will then influence how you then move on and approach the next stage of your life. That's what Erickson's talking about. Again, number of different stages throughout the course of our lives. How we resolve the challenges in one does influence and does impact the other. Now, nothing's fixed. It's not static. It's not given. But obviously, if we resolve those positively, we're more likely to have positive outcomes in each stage. If we start off with a negative outcome, it creates a greater risk of a potential negative outcome in the next stage, as well. So again, what we're wanting to do is to promote, enhance the positive side of that challenge. And again, as we begin to move through each stage over the course of the semester and look at what the challenge is and look at how one stage impacts the other, that'll make more and more sense. All right, Erickson, again, life cycles theory, challenge at each stage. One stage builds on another, and it's a balancing of a positive and a corresponding negative trait. All right. Last theory that we want to look at, and then we'll actually begin to move into our first stage, is cognitive development. Again, if you've had psychology or some other educational courses, you've come across this particular theory. Piaget. Obviously, this is reflected to that cognitive domain that we've talked about. And a lot of what we're referring to here is how we learn to construct knowledge. And again, we're looking at those thought processes that we've talked about. Again, that ability to remember, to reason, to make decisions, and how we process information. Now, according to Piaget, and again, what we want to do is simply look at some of the key concepts here. Piaget suggested that cognitive development is the combined result of the development of the nervous system, and we'll look at that in more detail as we look at brain development and experience. Combined result of the development of the nervous system and experience. And so as the brain particularly begins to mature, and as we have new experiences in life, that combination of those two working together will impact how, again, our thought processes mature and develop over time. Now, Piaget's is really doesn't cover the entire lifespan. It is age-related, and there are stages. And as we move through different stages, particularly through childhood and up through adolescence, we'll take a look at those stages. And Piaget basically believed that thought processes, for the most part, kind of stabilized, and that there wasn't a lot of change after the period of adolescence. Now, more recent research would suggest that there are still some changes that are occurring well into young adulthood, and to some extent even into middle and later adulthood, though not as dramatic as they are in the earlier years. But again, they are age-related stages, and that at each stage the individual tends to look at, see, and understand the world a little bit differently. And again, as the brain begins to mature, and as the individual has new experiences, begins to construct that knowledge differently. Now, an important part of Piaget's theory is that there is continuous reorganization in terms of how a person understands and deals with their world or their environment. Now, one of the ways to maybe understand that concept is one of the things I said at the very beginning of the semester, is that in a lot of ways, and I think this is true for virtually almost any course, is that it's kind of like taking pieces of puzzles and putting them together to eventually create, hopefully, a clear and comprehensive picture. And each one of those pieces reflects a new piece of knowledge or a new piece of experience. And so, we've met for 2 or 3 times now, and you're getting new information today. And hopefully, what will you do with the information you get today? That's my hope and my desire. And then hopefully you'll do it again the next time we meet. Learn it and remember it. And what you get today, what do you want to do with what you've already learned? You want to apply it. You want to relate it to what you've already learned. And then, again, you add another piece to that kind of puzzle. And so as you get new information, you integrate that with what you already have. And you may reorganize, you may restructure some of that information differently, or begin to understand it differently. As we begin to apply some of the theories, hopefully they'll start to have more meaning to you than, at this point, nothing more than really some concepts written down on paper. And what we want to do is begin to apply those as we look at the different stages of development, and then hopefully that new information, as it gets applied to what you already have, again, allows that, again, to have more meaning to you. And so as we go through life continually, as we have new experiences, we relate that experience to what we already know and what we already believe. And some of that new knowledge or that new information, this is what Piaget means by constructing knowledge. You hear something, and if you think that makes sense to you, then you're going to fit that with what you already know and believe. But if you hear something that you don't like or you don't believe or it doesn't fit, what are you likely to do with that piece of information or knowledge? Disregard it. It's kind of like a computer. You got information that comes in, and you may choose to save it and store it, with what you already have there. But if it's something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you, you don't find particularly meaningful, you're likely to hit the delete button, and just simply remove it, and doesn't become a part of your system. So again, Piaget suggests that it's a continuous, ongoing process. Again, as the brain matures and as the individual continues to have new experiences, that's how the individual constructs knowledge. And what we will discover as a person moves through the stages, their thought processes become more complex. And what we're going to find and what we're going to discover is that a 2-year-old will see the world very differently than a 4-year-old. And a 4-year-old will look at and understand the world very differently than a child that's in elementary school. And to some extent, the elementary school child will still look at and understand the world very differently than an adolescent. And likewise, adolescents see the world and understand the world differently somewhat than adults. And as we look at cognitive development at those different stages, what we want to do is look at that continuous reorganization and processing and understanding, and look at what kinds of experiences influence those changes, over time. All right, with that, the question to you is, when does human development begin? Conception. When do we sometimes have a tendency to think human development begins? At birth. Why? I think you're exactly right. I think a lot of times when you throw that question out, differently, but a lot of people very quickly say at birth. Yeah, one, it's not readily visible to us. Tangible, exactly. And so we tend to think of sometimes that human development occurs at birth. However, what I suggest to you is that human development begins at conception. And that for us, that's going to represent the first stage. In our next class period, we're going to begin to look at that first stage, prenatal development. Most importantly to understand is that what happens during that first stage is critical to every other stage that follows. And even though we tend to minimize sometimes and overlook the significance of this first stage, what we want to do is to try to understand not only what's happening during that stage, and that there are actually some stages within that stage, but again, how adults respond to what's happening, with that developing child during that stage lays the foundation for what will follow afterwards. Not really enough time today to really start that, and so our next class period we will take a look at our first stage, prenatal development, and then begin to look at what's happening physically, emotionally, to some extent cognitively, and even some extent socially at that first stage. All right, we'll see you next time.